The reason Trump launched this tariff war is ridiculously straightforward. He claims that the United States has long had a huge trade deficit and that the whole world is taking advantage of the US. However, this argument simply doesn't hold water. Today, let's thoroughly analyze whether the US actually has a trade deficit, where its dilemmas lie, what the core contradictions are, and how China is responding to the US's unreasonable actions. First, let's look at whether the US really has a trade deficit. If we only focus on merchandise trade, the situation in the US is truly dismal. In 2024, the merchandise trade deficit reached a staggering $1.2 trillion, setting a historical record. But if we take a broader view and consider the overall global economic activities of the US, it is actually raking in huge profits. The merchandise trade statistics by customs are merely the tip of the iceberg in global economic activities. The capital flows that don't go through customs are the real big source of wealth. Take the overseas multinational subsidiaries of the US as an example. They earn profits exceeding $1 trillion every year, and in 2022, it was as high as $1.4 trillion. This alone is enough to fill the US's merchandise trade deficit. This is the hidden wealth gathering mechanism of the US. Moreover, in terms of trade in services, the US is definitely a surplus country. Non-merchandise revenues such as patent fees and internet platform fees rank first globally. In 2024, the surplus reached $295 billion and is still growing. Additionally, the US also has incomes from arms exports and military services that are not counted in merchandise trade, which are also not to be underestimated. Let's use a simple model to look at the US's capital inflows and outflows. The data is roughly estimated. The US's annual foreign income includes $1.1 trillion in profits from multinational subsidiaries. Among them, $250 billion is repatriated to the US, and the remaining $850 billion stays overseas. Military trade is $150 billion, and the trade in services surplus is $300 billion. In total, it is $1,550 billion. And for foreign expenditures, the main one is the $1.20 trillion merchandise trade deficit. After offsetting revenues and expenditures, the US nets $350 billion from the world every year. How can this be considered a loss? It is clearly making a fortune. However, Trump only saw the $1.20 trillion deficit in merchandise trade and completely ignored other surpluses, especially the huge profits of multinational corporations. The customs trade figures are like the tip of the iceberg floating on the water, while the massive invisible wealth beneath the water is the real main body. We have all been deceived by this simple and crude number game of the US. So, where exactly are the dilemmas of the American empire? Trump feels that the US is at a loss, and the red-necked people in the US are also having a hard time. The comparison of the living standards between Chinese and American people further highlights the difficult livelihood situation in the US, indicating that there must be a major problem with the US economy. After all, under normal circumstances, it is impossible for a country to be making huge profits while its people are getting poorer. If we extract a part of the previous economic schematic diagram of the US and only look at the domestic situation in the US, the contradictions are immediately exposed. Although the US multinational subsidiaries make profits of over $1 trillion every year, only about $250 billion is repatriated to the US each year, and most of the profits remain overseas. Suddenly, the US's external balance of payments becomes $500 billion. If we further divide American society into three classes, the situation becomes even more obvious. The US's foreign income basically goes into the pockets of the elite class. Profits from multinational corporations, repatriation, surpluses in high-end services such as patent fees and the so-called Apple tax, and military trade are things that ordinary people can't get a share of. But for the bottom-level red-necked people, due to the hollowing out of the US manufacturing industry, they can only earn meager incomes from ordinary services. However, there are a large number of them, and most of the $1.20 trillion merchandise trade deficit in the US is contributed by them. As a result, the elite class is getting richer with surpluses, the bottom level red-necked people are suffering more with deficits, and the federal government, due to various legitimate tax avoidance methods of multinational corporations, has less and less tax revenue and can only exploit the bottom level red-necked people more severely. What does this look like? It's simply like the script of the late stage of an ancient Chinese dynasty. The landlords and powerful clans rise, the common people are impoverished, and the imperial court's finances collapse. In ancient China, it was called land annexation. In the current situation of the US, it is wealth annexation. At this point, the empire is not far from a regime change. However, after all, the US is the world's #1 power, and the US dollar is still the global currency. It still has a way to stay afloat, which is to issue US Treasury bonds. The US government issues US Treasury bonds with its credit as a guarantee. The Federal Reserve prints US dollars to buy US Treasury bonds, and global investors also flock to buy US Treasury bonds. In this way of living beyond its means, the US has managed to hold on for decades. But now, the US debt scale has exceeded $36 trillion, and the annual interest alone is as high as $1 trillion. It's almost at the breaking point. From a fiscal perspective, this is the most urgent contradiction the US is facing at present. The US has not given up struggling. When Trump came to power, he wanted to save the US economy. As mentioned before, the main source of the US's profits lies in those multinational corporations. Their overseas subsidiaries make profits of over $1 trillion every year, but most of them remain overseas. Before 2018, these profits were left overseas mainly for tax avoidance purposes in addition to reinvestment. Because if the profits are repatriated to the US, a 35% tax has to be paid. Although part of the national tax can actually be deducted, the tax rate is still very high. As long as they are not stupid, multinational corporations definitely want to keep their money in low tax regions overseas. For example, Apple has long kept $250 to $300 billion in profits in Ireland. The total profits retained by US overseas subsidiaries once exceeded $3 trillion. To change this situation, in 2018, the Trump administration promoted tax reform, significantly reducing the profit repatriation tax rate. An additional profit tax of 10.5% is uniformly imposed on the profits of overseas subsidiaries. This is already a huge compromise by the federal government. It not only reduces the tax rate, but also strengthens extraterritorial jurisdiction, imposing taxes regardless of whether the profits are repatriated to the US. Moreover, to attract the repatriation of historically retained profits, a time-limited tax rate preferential policy is given, with the tax rate for non-cash profits as low as 8%. This policy did have an effect when it was first introduced. In 2018, the repatriation of profits by US overseas companies reached $1 trillion. But then, there was nothing more. After the explosive repatriation, the repatriation of profits by US overseas subsidiaries has been getting less and less. In recent years, it has been less than $20 billion per year. What's even more strange is that the profits of these subsidiaries have started to shrink. People who understand finance know that this is multinational corporations playing financial games, inflating costs and hiding profits, and their tax avoidance methods are becoming more and more sophisticated. Truly, capital has no motherland. The US government shows leniency, but they don't appreciate it. On April 5, 2021, US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen called for setting a global minimum corporate tax rate at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development (OECD) meeting to prevent multinational enterprises from shifting profits to low-tax regions or evading tax obligations. This plan will surely be supported by countries with many overseas subsidiaries, while tax havens will definitely oppose it. It's extremely difficult to form a unified system globally. Interestingly, China also supports the global minimum corporate tax rate. Since Chinese enterprises are expanding overseas on a large scale, although there hasn't been a large amount of tax avoidance cases yet, it's better to prevent potential problems in advance. We won't elaborate too much on this to avoid unnecessary speculation. In the long run, the US's self-rescue actions have basically been ineffective. On one hand, economic policies vary greatly among countries around the world, and it's indeed difficult to regulate overseas multinational corporations. On the other hand, due to the hollowing out of the US manufacturing industry and the lack of a complete industrial chain, even if overseas companies want to repatriate their profits to the US, there is no suitable place for investment. Take Chinese overseas companies as an example. When they make profits, they basically repatriate the money back to China. Why? Because there is a complete supply chain in China, and overseas companies need to purchase equipment and spare parts from the domestic market. However, in the case of the US, its industrial chain is mostly overseas. When overseas companies repatriate their profits to the US, apart from distributing dividends, what else can they do? There's nothing else they can do. So, hundreds of billions of dollars remain overseas every year, unable to return to the US and unable to drive the development of the US economy. The wealth distribution in the US is becoming increasingly polarized. In the end, except for a small group of the top prominence, the US is basically divided into two classes: the wealthy elite class and the poor bottom-level red-necked people. The current situation is that the Democratic Party, which advocates globalization, stands with the elite class, while the Republican Party, which advocates localization, has joined forces with the bottom-level red-necked people and those declining local capitalists, resulting in a severely polarized situation between the red and blue camps. The elite class is small in number but rich, while the red-necked people are numerous but poor. Wealth is increasingly concentrated in the hands of the elite class, indicating that there is a serious problem with the wealth distribution in the US. This is the core contradiction of the US. In comparison, issues such as the tariff deficit and the non-repatriation of profits from overseas subsidiaries are only important problems. After all, US foreign trade accounts for only about 1/4 of its GDP, and the flow of domestic wealth is the major part. Therefore, the core problem of the US is that there are obstacles to the upward and downward flow of domestic wealth, while the internal and external flow of wealth is only a secondary contradiction. The conflict between the two parties in the US has now evolved into a class conflict, which is a major trouble that capitalist countries will inevitably face sooner or later. Objectively speaking, the US federal government has made a lot of efforts to combat monopolies during the Cold War in order to demonstrate that the capitalist system was superior to the socialist system. Under the pressure of the Soviet Union, the US had been trying to avoid a large gap between the rich and the poor. However, just over 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the social contradictions in the US can no longer be reconciled. If class contradictions are left unattended, they will surely trigger a class revolution and lead to a major reshuffle of society. Under normal circumstances, the solution should be internal reform, and the red-necked people's criticism should be directed at the US elite class. However, the US system, by its very nature, makes it impossible to carry out internal reform. The US is a federal system, similar to the feudal enfeoffment system in ancient times. Each state has its own autonomy, with different laws and even its own armed forces. The federal government has no power to appoint or remove personnel in the states, so reform is simply out of the question. The power of the federal government mainly lies in external affairs, such as foreign trade, diplomacy, and foreign wars. This is why the US always tries to solve internal problems through external means. Even if the federal government had the ability to reform, it lacks the motivation. The various institutions of the US federal government are basically engaged in political struggles, and everyone is protecting their own interests and taking advantage of the federal government. When the US first became independent, in the first government formed by George Washington, among the 6 core figures including the President, Vice President, Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of War, and Attorney General, 5 of them, or their families, owned a large number of slaves. This is the true nature of US politics. When Trump came to power for the second time, facing the crisis in the US and the anger of the red-necked people, he wanted to carry out reform on one hand and still tried to solve internal problems through external means on the other. He aimed to centralize power through reform, purge his political opponents, and make a profit for himself. This is a true portrayal of the US, where no organization can truly confront the deep-seated contradictions. Now let's see how China has responded to Trump's series of actions. Trump is now like a madman, lashing out at anyone who can gain the support of the red-necked people. After lashing out, he then talks about the so-called art of the deal. His only goal is to win. China clearly understands Trump's intentions, so it generally doesn't provoke him actively. Instead, it just watches him act on his own, waiting for him to expose his own flaws. This is a smart approach. If Trump takes the initiative to provoke, China will not back down. It will give him a firm counterstrike to make him feel the pain, and then quickly avoid getting entangled with him. After all, Trump doesn't represent the entire US. He can at most represent half of the Americans, as there is still the Democratic Party and its base in the US. In the current situation, the Democratic Party is a force that China can strive to win over. Therefore, China has adopted the strategy of allying with one faction and confronting the other. China's countermeasures against Trump are very tough, which is like giving him a blow to make him aware of the consequences. However, upon careful consideration, China's countermeasures actually leave a lot of room for maneuver, making it convenient for Trump to compromise after feeling the pain. Moreover, China's countermeasures rarely harm the Democratic Party, mainly manifested in the following aspects. First, attack the treacherous ministers rather than the muddled monarch. Since Trump launched the trade war during his first term, China has been criticizing the US government. In particular, it has severely criticized Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who had no strong background but held a high position, and even imposed sanctions on him, making it difficult for him to survive in both the political and business circles after leaving office. However, China has never directly criticized Trump by name and has always used the US government instead, giving him enough face. Recently, China's countermeasures against the US still follow this strategy. No matter how many negative things Trump says about China, the official statements never directly criticize him but always use the US side to refer to the relevant actions. However, when Vice President Vance called China bumpkins, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs immediately stood up to refute. Second, the countermeasures directly target Trump's base without implicating the Democratic Party. In Sino-US trade, China imports a large amount of US agricultural products, especially soybeans, which is part of Trump's base. Therefore, once there is a conflict with Trump, China first takes action in the agricultural field. In another major aspect of Sino-US trade, trade in services, the US has an export advantage. For example, Apple's Apple tax and various patent fees are part of the Democratic Party's base. Among the major economies, China and the EU originally had the highest Apple tax. However, the EU often imposed anti-monopoly penalties on Apple, which eventually led to a reduction in their Apple tax. But China has never targeted Apple Inc. and has not imposed sanctions on the US through trade in services. This is a typical example of winning over the Democratic Party, creating trouble for Trump, and at the same time leaving a cornerstone for Sino-US cooperation. Third, in this round of countermeasures against the US, the 20 free trade zones within the Chinese mainland and Hong Kong do not participate in the tariff war. This is mainly a consideration for the domestic economy and employment. Many of China's free trade zones have foreign, invested industrial chains, and a large number of spare parts are imported from the US. For example, in a certain free trade zone, the Foxconn assembly plant mainly assembles Apple products, and many of its spare parts are imported from the US. If the shortage of spare parts occurs due to the tariff war, it would not be a sanction against the US, but rather self-sanction. From this, we can see that the economies of China and the US are deeply integrated, with each having a part in the other. It is extremely difficult to achieve a complete decoupling. In addition, this is also a way of not targeting the Democratic Party, because multinational corporations are part of the Democratic Party's base. It can be seen that China's countermeasures are both tough and leave room for maneuver. After all, if China and the US completely break off relations, it will be detrimental to both sides. If Trump can stop his actions in time, that would be the best. If he continues to act recklessly, China will give him another strong counterstrike and then continue to wait for him to change his course.